The philosophy of Muhammad Iqbal, nature of intuition. Iqbal is on the assumption that the ultimate truths which religion and metaphysics seek to emphasize are not known by us in the ordinary way. The ordinary way is the way of experience. In this level, whatever is known under space time dimension and is useful from the empirical and pragmatic point of view. But the reality in itself cannot be directly known in this level of experience. Basing himself on the Quranic idea on heart, he says that the heart is a kind of inner intuition or insight which brings us into contact with aspects of reality. So, thereby, he presents the heart as the faculty of intuition, and intuition is the way through which reality can be apprehended directly. He also speaks of the important characteristics of intuition. The important character of intuition is its immediacy. Intuition is the immediate knowledge of the reality because it does not require any medium. Secondly, intuitive knowledge is always a unity or wholeness which is not analyzable. In intuition, the knower becomes one with the known, and the distinction between the subject and the object disappears altogether. Thirdly, intuition is a movement of intimate relationship with the Supreme. It is a feeling of the presence of the divine. According to Iqbal, this intuitive experience has an objectivity about it. It is neither a subjective state nor merely a private and personal experience. The object of the intuition is not the mere creation of the individual's intellect, but the object of the experience is really there. Iqbal asserts that the intuition is not the property of the mind or intellect, but it is the property of the heart. He also says that the intuitive experience helps one realize eternity in a moment. He further explains that this experience gives the individual a sense of the unreality of serial time. Lastly, he speaks of the incommunicable nature of this intuitive experience. It is not communicable because of the simple reason that it is the function of the heart. He also says that though the content of this experience cannot be communicated, a mystic can interpret this experience in terms of verbal form, and this interpreted truth can be easily communicated. Concept of self. Traditionally, self is considered as that principle which organizes the activities and the experiences of an individual and gives them significance different from the bodily activities. In line with the traditional understanding, Iqbal also says that the self is the principle of unity in the individual, but he asserts that it not opposed to the bodily. He affirms that the self gives unity even to bodily activities. He develops his idea of self in tune with the Quranic conception of self and prefers to use the word ego for the self. He asserts the necessity to accept the reality of the self. He explains that no mental state can exist in isolation, but there must be a unity organizing all the mental states. Parts of the material object can exist as isolated, but mental state cannot. This principle of unity of inner life or of the mental state is called as ego. It is the ego which keeps all experiences organized and united. It shows that it is the ego which organizes and gives a final shape and directions to our various affections and experiences. Iqbal seems to be against the doctrine of parallelism of the body and the soul. According to him, both the body and the soul are systems of acts, and as activities, they are close to each other. The self is a series of activities and it needs an environment on which it will act or to which it will react. In other words, ego cannot remain in complete isolation, it must have a world. The ego is confronted with the world of non ego, and it is through his experience of the world of the non ego that the life of the ego grows and develops. We have seen that all the experience is organized by ego. Such a conclusion leads to one of the important questions in philosophy. Does the ego determine its own activities or is it casually determined by something else? This question is all about the question of freedom. Iqbal is of the opinion that the ego has the capacity to choose its course of action and thereby ego is free. Another important character of the self is its immortality. According to him, the self is immortal in spite of its apparent fact of death. He believes that the self has the capacity to survive death and thereby it is immortal. His concept of God, basing himself strongly on the Islamic understanding of God, Iqbal declares his firm conviction on monotheism. For him, the question of God is more important because it satisfies not only the religious urge of man or woman, but also his or her metaphysical curiosity. God is the supreme ego. Iqbal believes that the universe is of the nature of a free creative force. He is of the opinion that the world process is purposive and is rationally directed. According to him, rational egos are capable of regulating and directing their own creative life. So it prompts us to think that there's a being directing the creative life of the universe. So he comes to the conclusion that it is the superego that guides the creative progress of the world. Here he also explains the Quranic description of God as light. Iqbal thinks that light is the nearest metaphor for understanding the nature of the absolute ego, which is the most perfect embodiment of dynamic and creative life. Attributes of God. While talking about the attributes of God, he makes a distinction between the attributes apprehended by intuitive insight and those known through intellectual deliberations. Here he mainly speaks of the intellectual attributes of God. According to him, creativeness, knowledge, omnipotence, eternity, immanence, transcendence, etc., are some of the main attributes of God. Creativeness. The supreme ego is creative in the way in which an ego is creative. He says that the supreme ego or God is creative in the inner way. It means that God creates completely from within himself. For supreme ego, creation means the unfolding of his own inner possibilities. His creativeness is infinite because these possibilities are infinite. Knowledge. For a finite ego or being, the knowledge is based on the distinction between knower and the known. So the finite being knows the other, which is something different from the subject, but God is all comprehensive. So there is no other for God. In other words, in Him, thought and deed, the act of knowing and the act of creating are identical. God Himself is the object of His knowledge. God creates as He knows and knows as He creates. Omnipotence. Iqbal explains the Quranic understanding of divine omnipotence. The divine omnipotence, according to Quran, is intimately connected with the concept of divine wisdom. One cannot neglect one of the important questions that the attribution of omnipotence to God raises. It raises the question of presence of evil in the world. He solves this problem by explaining the concept of freedom given to human by God for making it possible for him to bring out the potentialities latent in human beings. At the same time, human can use this freedom rightly or misuse this freedom for wrong choice. He considers that freedom is a basic requirement for goodness. So he considers pain and suffering as a necessary aspect of the fact of freedom. He likes to treat both good and evil within the same whole. Eternity, while does not treat eternity as a time concept, he does not speak of an idea of endlessness of time. God is considered eternal because he is the expression of the infinite possibilities latent in God. In this sense, God is portrayed as eternal. Immanence and transcendence. According to Iqbal, God is both immanent and transcendent, but God is not immanent in the world as a pantheistic understand. He is immanent in the world in the sense that the world is his creation. God is presented as transcendent in the sense that the God is beyond the grasp of the finite ego. So, by way of presenting God as a unity of infinite possibilities, the metaphysical demand of human being is satisfied. And by conceiving God as personal and supreme ego, the religious demand is also satisfied. The nature of the world. Like many of the contemporary Indian thinkers who are aware of the present scientific exploration in determining the nature of the material world, Iqbal also asserts the reality of the world. He asserts that the external world exists and is real. Before we enter into the question of the nature of the material world, it is necessary to understand Iqbal's conception of space and time. According to Iqbal, space and time are relative. They're relative not only to the different grades of being but also to the different levels of experience of the same being. The impression of space and time that we have will be different from the impression of space and time that other animals may have. He further explains that the physical world is understood in the analogy of the self. So the world is conceived as a continuous movement. He also finds that the universe also exhibits a tendency to egohood. The universe manifests a clear tendency to grow as an individual. An individual is a unity of its parts, and the parts cannot exist apart from the whole. Iqbal applies the same principle to the universe, where he says that even though one finds diverse and discrete aspects of the universe, there exists an inner unity among them all. He draws the conclusion by saying that the whole physical world can be viewed as an individual. This is the reason why Iqbal says that every detail of the world is an ego, and the totality of the ego is the ego of the egos. So, if the nature of the world is that of ego, it is nothing but growing. It has a reason, purpose, and a plan, and steadily progresses towards the realization of an end. Human destiny. In short, according to Iqbal, the realization of immortality is considered as the ultimate human destiny. Immortality is presented both as soul's nature and as a person's destiny. Death is not the end of the soul. The soul survives the death and continues to exist even after death. But this is not all about immortality. One will be truly immortal only when these potentialities are fully and freely expressed. That is one's real destiny. The realization and free expression of all the potentialities is embedded in this self. Iqbal asserts that it is through persistent and continuous action one realizes it. It is in this sense that Iqbal presents immortality as ultimate human destiny. Iqbal tries to highlight 3 points in respect to immortality which the Quran speaks of. First of all, he says that the finite ego has a beginning. It speaks of the finiteness and humanness of man or woman. The finite ego is a created being. So, immortality is that of the immortality of a created being, and therefore, immortality does not mean attaining godhood. Secondly, he says that there is no possibility of its return to the earth. It implies that once the soul is free from the body, a person is free from the bondage of birth or rebirth and awaits the final judgment with regard to his or her destiny. So, it does not involve a belief in rebirth. Thirdly, he states that finitude of the ego is not a misfortune. He criticizes those who are on the assumption that finitude is nothing but evil. He says that the dignity and uniqueness of the individual can be retained only when an individual is approached with his individuality.